Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Bob the Booker, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about the books that I've read this week. And I record this pre-Eurovision, and so I'm very excited for when this video goes out. We will know the results, and my Eurovision reading challenge video will come out shortly after. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about the books that I read this week. First up, I read The Body Where I Was Born by Guadalupe Nettel, and translated by J.T. Lichtenstein. And this is, so Guadalupe Nettel, her book Stillborn is on the International Booker shortlist, I should say. And so I was really keen to go back and read more of her work because I absolutely loved Stillborn. And so I was really fascinated to check this out. And it's such a different book in many ways, but it has a lot of that same joy that I found in Stillborn. So essentially the idea of this is our main character is looking back over her life from a psychiatrist's couch. So she is looking back over the moments that made her. And so we have, for example, her as a young girl, moving countries sort of semi-frequently, the kind of family dynamics of all of that, but also, you know, her as this sort of rebellious young girl who sort of fights people around her and isn't sort of gonna, you know, go down without a fight. And she's just this really intriguing character because then we also see her as an adult, and we also perhaps understand some of her adult choices through the lens of her as this young girl who was quite rambunctious and rebellious, and, you know, would fight the boys who were trying to you know, get one over on her. And so it's this really interesting and beautiful book, I thought. There's something, again, I mean, obviously the styles of these books are quite different in many ways, but there's something in the writing that I still found really quite compelling. There's a purpose and a sort of ferocity sometimes to the words that I just found really captivating. So yeah, I'm really intrigued to read more of her work, and just keep going through all of it, because I think I've discovered an author who I really, really gel with and would like to read a lot more of. Next up, and I'm not fully finished with it yet, but I'm almost there, The Collected Fictions of Jorge Luis Borges, translated by Andrew Hurley. And so this is all of his sort of collected fictions, all of the sort of sets of stories and these other things. And I sort of am reading this as part of a reading kind of, well, read-along sort of challenge with Micah and with Anne Novella, both wonderful booktubers you should check out, and I'll tag them below. But what's been really interesting about this for me, I think, is I read Borges when I was maybe like 18, and I got like a very cheap, like short version where, you know, one of those like Penguin, like 70 years kind of thing, or whatever it was, where they sort of put together a few of his short stories. And I remember being absolutely in love with them. Reading them as an adult now, I'm kind of starting to feel a little, I mean, stupid, maybe not. I mean, but like, just, I'm not sure if I'm fully getting them. And I feel like a lot of these short stories really require a lot of attention and focus, which I've not always been able to give them. So it's partly on me. But I think overall, I've been just really enjoying being in Borges' world, and this sort of, his sort of style of writing, which at times can be almost like reportage, right? Or reportage, I guess. And this sort of very focused style that almost feels like he's given you sort of a sort of journalistic piece, but actually it's a fictional work, and just the way of him describing characters or describing worlds has this sort of journalistic quality to it. So I've been really enjoying that, and the kind of weird and wonderful things that occasionally come up in them. I think just at times I've sort of come to the end of a short story and not necessarily known what's happened or what I got from it, but I think at the same time the ride is often the fun thing with Borges. Just these sort of fantastical worlds sometimes, and then sometimes these very plain, ordinary, run-of-the-mill stories with something kind of fantastical to it. So yeah, really interesting, and I'm kind of keen to read the last book of it within this. But yeah, exciting times, and yeah, an interesting book, and I'm really glad that I've sort of gone back and read this now and sort of had a chance to re-engage with his work, even if it doesn't always, like, even if I don't always manage to find a way of gelling with it personally, but it's interesting nonetheless. Next up, I read To Battersea Park by Philip Hensher, and I haven't read anything of his before, but I've been meaning to, and know that I basically will have to at some point as part of the Booker Challenge, because he was shortlisted for the Northern Clemency. But this was a really interesting book that I enjoyed a lot more than I was expecting to, I think. And I say expecting to, it wasn't like I had a really low expectation of it. It's just that it's a novel that deals with lockdown. And part of me was sort of like, oh, have I had enough of those? Do I really want to revisit those years? But actually, I think it does it really well, and wears it in quite a clever way. So Philip Hensher takes as the sort of central idea, essentially several characters navigating lockdown. And whereas that sounds like such a kind of typical cliched idea for a story, I think it sort of goes beyond that for me. I think of, it always, any lockdown novel runs the risk of sounding incredibly cliched. But I think Battersea Park does it fairly well. So what it does, for example, is focuses on the kind of the wider sort of ramifications of this. So it looks a little bit at the kind of individual lives and what's happening there, and a little bit about the sort of wider ramifications. But it wears both fairly lightly, I think, in a good way. So, for example, one of our main characters is a novelist, and a novelist writing about a novelist, groundbreaking. But I think what's really interesting is that the novel then plays with ideas of literary technique and how form and function sort of meld essentially together. So our character, this sort of main character, this novelist, he is sort of talking about, describing ways that novelists or writers would describe certain things and how they pitch a scene. And then as a result, we learn that sort of, a character talking about things in the present tense or in the past tense constantly has a certain way of affecting the reader. And what I think is kind of quite subtle about that is the literary techniques then also sort of go into a wider discussion about how we as humans reflect on something as bizarre and wide-reaching as lockdown and a pandemic and all of these sorts of things. So actually, I thought it was really clever and really well played all the way throughout. And I was kind of just intrigued by what this novel does. There's also a character who is suffering from sort of early stages of, I think, dementia in the book, or maybe Alzheimer's, I can't remember exactly which now. And so her thoughts are really quite scattered. And so there's that, plus the fact that the world around her is changing. And then there are these sort of wider conversations around, if a state has told you that you can't do something that feels so human as to meet someone, then what does that look like for people as well? So I thought actually the novel, I listened to a lot of this as an audiobook while walking a dog. And so there was something quite interesting about listening to it whilst walking around a park. And, so much of the novel deals with the idea of outdoor spaces and kind of weird interactions. And I really enjoyed what the book had to say and how it said it, essentially. I think it's an interesting one. And I would be intrigued to see whether he will be longlisted for the Booker again this year. Next, keeping in with the theme of Booker and Booker nonsense, I am sort of going and reading some of the books from other shortlists. And so I'll be talking a bit more about these in their respective shortlists. But here are a couple that I read this week. So first was Andre Brink's Rumours of Rain. And this was shortlisted way back in 1978. And I'm reading it as sort of part of that thing I might have mentioned before of reading 78, 83, 88, blah, blah, blah. All the kind of the 3s and 8s all the way in the lead up to 2023, this year's Booker. Boring side amble, but there we go. And Rumours of Rain is a book that I found really quite fascinating in several ways. It's a novel that deals with apartheid South Africa. So, a fairly heavy topic. It's easy to, you can say. And what I think is quite fascinating is our main character in this book, whose name I keep forgetting, Martin Meinhardt. He is, and I've just dropped a book, he is our sort of oblivious narrator. We as the audience sort of read around him almost. He'll say things and he'll sort of see sort of black South Africans, and he will say certain things that are both racist and also just cruel a lot of the time, and also sort of just really ill thought out. And he'll say all these things, and we as the reader have the ability to sort of look around him and say, okay, so he's clearly wrong in everything he's saying here, but also he then sort of is a stand-in for how politics in South Africa sort of work within that time. And I say this not knowing a great deal about South African politics, but he is this sort of interesting stand-in. And so as he, throughout the book, starts to change his opinions on things, as he starts to understand parts of the world a little bit differently, and particularly starts to revise some of his opinions, he perhaps also starts to see how he's personally involved, not only in reinforcing some of those opinions, but also how actually it has ramifications on him and his life. He starts to see those and sort of is our kind of anti-hero sort of becoming not quite a hero, but a kind of a reformed anti-hero in some way. And so I think this book I thought was really quite interesting. I think obviously for South African writers, apartheid is this huge thing that is, is there, and you can't almost talk about South Africa without it being a big part of what you speak about. So I think this book is, I'd imagine, like one of the earlier ones. I imagine sort of time-wise, 78, but is fascinating for that, I think. Yeah, just a sort of a really comprehensive but kind of terrifying look at kind of the effects of those politics, I think, in South Africa. And shortlisted in 1993, Caryl Phillips with Crossing the River. And this book also actually deals quite a lot with race and with identity in a very, very different way. So there's a kind of dreamy aspect to this book in the way that it kind of weaves together narratives. And in kind of doing so, it builds this idea of kind of a voice of diaspora, or a voice of sort of Africanness, I guess, within the book, that kind of spans quite a few generations. So a large part, well, the early part of this book deals a lot with slavery and enslavement, and it deals a lot with the kinds of ways that kind of people's thoughts were programmed, almost kind of in some ways like Rumours of Rain, kind of how people come to have some of those opinions, and again how those are challenged by humanizing, or by seeing people of color, particularly here sort of black enslaved Africans, as like being able to see them as humans. And so some of the characters, once they have these moments of realization, there's this sort of dynamic of, there's this sort of evangelizing church mission, and this sort of how for some people, they see their success as being how many people they've converted to Christianity. But actually, at the same time, they are sort of unaware of how they themselves are not particularly Christian people, and so in their actions. So there's a set of letters from a young man to his father, who is this sort of influential figure within the church, and he is trying to find a way for his father to kind of be proud of him and to kind of acknowledge the work he's done, and also send him over some resources so that he can continue some of this work. And he basically comes to realize that his father is not this saint of a person, despite the work that he does. And so there's this really kind of complicated but intriguing discussion going on there in the book. And the second, well, sort of third part of the book, I guess, is this different narrative altogether, set in sort of closer to our current time, sort of around World War II. And that is a woman in Yorkshire talking about a sort of her experience of basically the war. So the men have gone off to fight, and she is, left at home, and she's got this husband who doesn't seem particularly great. He comes home early from the war with a sort of chest infection, or I think it's sort of described as black lung, and so he cannot continue to fight. And so that kind of brings up these kind of questions about masculinity and manhood. And equally at the same time, US GIs are in town. And so suddenly there's this sort of excitement of all of these Americans in these US GIs all around Yorkshire. and these people being, oh, well, this is very exciting, and they bring with them cigarettes and chocolate and all these other things. But actually, then the kind of, you know, that also for a lot of people is their first experience potentially with not only people from the US, but black people from the US. And so there's this sort of discussion that also comes in around race and identity and nationality that's really quite complex and interwoven. And the diary entries from this woman are kind of scattered in terms of time. You know, you'll have two that are months next to each other, then you'll have one 3 years in the future, and then back to the another time. It just keeps jumping, and in some ways that broken narrative is really indicative of the rest of this novel in a really clever way, where all three of those narratives become this really tangled web of all three individually have so much to say about African diaspora and how they sort of turn up and are approached, or sort of how they're seen in every scenario that they end up in. And so it's this kind of fascinating thing. And I really loved this book. I thought it was really very clever for what it does in like a smidge over 200 pages, really. It's really quite impressive. The kind of the ways that he as an author is able to get inside the heads of these characters. I genuinely believed that I was reading the diary of a Yorkshire woman from the 1940s. You know, it's this sort of ventriloquism of it is really quite profound, and I think is a really exceptional novel. And that's everything I've read this week. I hope you are keeping well. I hope you I hope you've been having a good week. I hope you've been reading some lovely books. Take care, and I will speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.